Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you again in Accra, Professor Soyinka. Our conversation will go back in time to the 1950s, and then we will move on. We will start, and I'll do so by asking you this question. You once said to me in 1999, and you repeated it in 2007, that your generation thought of itself as the Renaissance people. And in the same conversation, you also said that your generation was a wasted generation. What really was your generation?
I think that statement was the result of the consequence of aiming too high, of having a much larger vision, a prospectus, which was beyond, perhaps, what was attainable. And so for me, at that time, and with the kind of impatience of creativity in various aspects, not just my own field alone, which one had at the time, I just felt that the energy that we put into that period was, the result was it just didn't add up to what I thought society, humanity could make use of. You have to remember the enthusiasm and the energy that went with independence. We were terminating, humiliating for me, a period of external domination. The common words are colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, etc. We were coming out of a period of a kind of global disdain of our race, and we were determined to have an exercise in race retrieval, building on that. And after so many years of independence, at the time when we spoke, I just felt that what we were able to point out as a result of that enthusiasm fell far short of what our vision was. So, as I said, at that time, we were impatient and we couldn't accept half a loaf, let's put it that way. And so we said we were wasted completely. At least I did.
You were artists, that generation, playwrights, theater directors, novelists, poets, plastic artists. You were many things. And then we realized along the line that you were projecting more of an African personality, what Nkrumah made popular, than what probably was a cultural economy. Which was your base? Did you think at the time that you were contributing to a cultural economy of an emerging post-colonial continent, or that you wanted to construct a new personality based on which there could be a movement forward?
Well, the African personality, has always been a rather problematic expression for some of us, especially. It's a good slogan. It's a good buzz expression. But what did it really mean? The first thing to state is that there are several, just as there are several African cultures, there are also several African personalities. We were tossed between what you might call the purest sense of race recognition, the black race, the African race. And then there was a Pan-African dimension, which embraced also the diaspora. Now, on the continent itself, of course, we had sections like the Arab world, which in our estimate was already fulfilling itself in terms of self-identity. Culturally, even politically, it was struggling out of a period of a semi-feudal and theocratic state, things were happening in the Arab world, on the African continent. So sometimes when we said the African personality, we refused to accept the Arab. We said, listen, they've already gone far enough. We need a lot of catching up. And for that, the African personality was limited very strictly to the black African personality. The Arabs, even though they occupy the African continent, for me, we believe that they belong to another world. But the black world also, we extended beyond the Atlantic. The black world for us meant the diaspora, whether in the United States of America, whether in Cuba, whether in Brazil, Jamaica. For us, this was the real African personality. So you see, there was already a clash in terms of conceptualization of who we were, what we were, and how we wanted to head, what kind of culture we wanted to create. A very distinct, very unique one. It was a period of search, of quest for identity, for replacement of what we knew had been taken away by the European world, especially during the period of colonialism.
There were very deep cultural ideologies, negritude, and you even had issues, Anglophone, Francophone, as to where you should stand collectively. And this also led to resistance in ideas and sometimes clashes, personality-wise, ideology-wise.
Well, let me say that we were very impatient, at least my section, very impatient with Francophonie, Anglophonie, Lusophone, as far as we were concerned. These were mere temporary aberrations. That beneath it all, there was that unique conglomerate of African virtues and worldviews. This is one of the reasons why we created the Union of Writers of the African Peoples, for instance. And we began trying to use African language as much as possible, at least in terms of recognizing one another. That's when I wrote my long poem, Ogun Abibima, and we said, the people of Africa are the Ebibirim. I'm a Yoruba, but I borrowed that language from Ghana. And this is one of the ways in which we try to pull ourselves together and just put aside Francophonie, Anglophonie. But there was a problem there. There was a problem there because there were different forms of colonialism. There was settler colonialism, there was métissage, of course, there was even some kind of syncretism, and then there was the outright, what I call real cultural colonization, which was peculiar very much to the French. And inevitably, of course, that gave rise to negritude. Now, on the Anglophone side, the British were so arrogant, they felt, which was marvelous for us, because they felt, oh, these natives, they cannot really come up, they cannot absorb European culture, and so the British did a kind of surrogate control, to sort of second-tier control, in which they isolated just a few people and used them as a kind of barely tolerated ruling class. But the rest they left alone in their cultures. The French were different. The French wanted to make every black person, if possible, French. To be considered human, you had to be as French as possible. They even set their colonial subject tests to transit from being this primitive black person into the white French cultured society. They even made their subjects take tests. Not just, I'm not talking academic tests alone. I mean, your French had to be impeccable. But in addition, you had to hold your fork in a particular way. You had to use your serviette in a particular way. And your district officer who did the test then wrote a report and said, this one is ready to be French. And so you pass, and you left the others behind. We, on the other hand, we didn't undergo that. So we were very impatient with this thing called negritude. We said, negritude? I never lost my negritude. So why am I to go looking for it? I'm more interested in what's happening right here now between my rulers and myself. That was the difference. But later, of course, as we got to know each other, one another very well, lusophone, we recognized this difference. And so negritude and that word, tigritude, came closer together to form what I eventually call the black beatitude. That's the one you haven't heard before.
This brings me to the tools of your business.
The tools?
The tools of culture, languages. When the Institute of African Studies was set up in Accra, at Legon, and the Institute of African Studies was set up in Ibadan, the idea was that these will be institutes that will help with the preservation of African languages. And then the School of Oriental and African Studies, which had been long-standing, was the best place to study African languages. And now, Harvard University teaches more African languages than any other university in the world. Does it surprise you? Was there anything in the air that at your time prompted you to this possibility?
Oh, this was very much on the horizon. As writers, of course, language is our tool. Then the question is, what language? Then also, what purpose is that language supposed to serve? This is not a rhetorical question. It's very important because when the Union of Writers of African Peoples, for instance, took the decision to have a single language, common language among the black, south of the Sahara, and we decided on Kiswahili, after studying clinically the various languages, we decided that this was the most appropriate communication tool between the various indigenous languages as well as the colonial languages, which were still in effect. But when we went to Angola, for instance, to meet the liberation fighters there, we had one of these meetings, working strategies, and of course culture was a very important part, as you know, of the liberation struggle. And we met the Angolans. I remember distinctly, they looked at us and we came very proudly, you know, we'd done our work, our research, and we said, Kiswahili. So we wanted resolution from everybody that all literatures will be translated into Kiswahili, we'll compel or persuade schools to teach Kiswahili as a compulsory language, if necessary, take out one of the other subjects to make room for it, etc. We had the whole schedule all worked out. So they said, listen, we are involved in the liberation struggle. We have taken the Portuguese language and we're using that language as an instrument of liberation, of contact. In other words, we're using this language even against our own oppressors. If we decide now to adopt a common language, we're taking energy, strategy, resources away, we're creating suspicion among the various ethnic groups. It's better for us to continue with Portuguese. We can pick up your marvelous idea later on, but right now. So you see, it wasn't always as simple as many people think, you know. Some thought it's just a romantic idea, but it was also an economic idea. If you can, for instance, translate not just what is being produced now, but history, even scientific subjects, you translate them, you have one common language, you're already producing more material of teaching, of enlightenment, which is very good for the economy. It's good for printers, it's good for booksellers, it's good for bookshops, it's good for the writers also. Your royalties increase just a little bit. And so all these various factors guided or sort of influenced our decisions at that time. But there's no question at all in my mind, and I'm sure you agree with this, that language itself is an instrument, not just of livelihood. It's also of struggle, it's a language of economics, it's a language, it's an instrument of science, of teaching, of understanding. It even affects the human psyche, which means it also affects the collective psyche, binds people together or separates people. And so it was a period of great excitation because you kept picking up ideas, weighing them, trying them out, and being honest enough to say, this works, this doesn't work, this is more productive, even in other directions than within the discipline itself, etc., etc.
When Death and the King's Horseman was published, and it was later translated into Yoruba, it made huge headlines. And you made a remark when it was said that it was so well translated, that, well, it was being translated back into the language in which you took your inspiration from.
Oh, you're talking about specifically about Death and the King's Horseman.
Death and the King's Horseman.
Yes, that's right. Yes, this again was one of the interesting questions. As you know, I've done a lot of translation myself. Fagunwa, I've translated many of his works. And it becomes almost a new material when you're translating. In this particular case, however, when Akinshola translated this play, Death and the King's Horseman, critics asked him, and also consumers, didn't you find Wole Soyinka's English a little bit difficult to translate? And he said, no, at least not as far as this play is concerned. And that's when he made that statement. He said, I merely translated back a play which he had conceived in Yoruba. So I just took it back. I knew exactly what he was saying, what the words in English meant. So I said, there was no problem at all. I was able to give it back in Yoruba. And I think this sometimes is the case with translations. Not always. Not always, I must insist. And not in my case, I don't think not all translators will say the same of everything I've written.
So when Ngugi wa Thiong'o campaigns on decolonization of language and writes in Kikuyu, and then it gets translated into English so that there will be a wider readership, what then becomes of the language in which it was written? That is the original language in which he wrote.
Oh, that must always be preserved. And one of the decisions which we took was that no language must be allowed to die. That writers must continue to be encouraged to write in their own indigenous language. But of course, to make that work accessible, you've got to translate into other languages. Translation itself is a creative process in many instances. And UNESCO has been very, very positive about that. UNESCO does have that unwritten policy of the preservation of all languages. And why not? Language itself is a tool, is a creative tool. So why should you discard one tool in favor of another? I don't see why one shouldn't even give oneself the pleasure of reading a work. I have done, reading a work in French, and then saying, let me see how it reads in Spanish, how it reads in Twi, I read in Ewe, I read in Hausa, I read in Yoruba. You get different kinds of, shall we say, vibes very often from reading these translations. And also, let me tell you something. If you happen to be in prison detention and you want to keep what you're writing secretly, it's useful to have more than one language because you can fool your captors when you do your writing.
Well, as you're talking of UNESCO, we must as well look at the issue of cultural patrimony. We've been talking a lot these days about the return of stolen or looted art objects. You wrote in You Must Set Forth at Dawn the pain you went through when some of your artworks were stolen. Now, we are into a century, perhaps even more. People are talking of the return of the Benin bronze, the Ashanti regalia, and these are critical issues that we talk about. In Africa itself, there is no positive emotions in terms of the leadership reaction to some of these debates, and it's been ongoing for a very long time. What, in your view, should be the case? That items should be kept where the future could make use of them, or they should be kept in geographic locations of the originators?
Let me say this straight away. When your artworks, I mean the physical artworks, and in fact, always remember that heritage is more than just the physical one. We'll come to what UNESCO calls the non-material heritage as well. That's more complicated. But let's talk now about the physical artworks. When those works, which are a precipitate of your philosophy, your worldview, your very humanity, when they're taken away from you, especially when they're forcibly taken, when they're taken away from the environment, which makes them part and parcel of your very human existence and value, something is cut off you. You're no longer whole. You're no longer entire. If you're not aware of it, that's all right. But if you know that something which speaks to your culture, your history, your people, your worldview, is sitting somewhere else, you even see it there when you travel. There's a kind of violation, a very deep violation, which you cannot really totally overcome. You go home, you leave it there, but the memory of that thing, which is part of you, which has been just violently taken away from you, lingers. I've made people talk about reparations a lot. It'll never go, that word will never go away. It's part of it's part of the negative legacy that the world, with which the world has been burdened. I talk about reparations, and I've always proposed that, look, let the European world and the Asian world also, because some of the artworks are also in that area, let them just give back everything which has been stolen, and we will consider that. We're willing to promote the idea that that is reparations. And so we'll be ready to forgive the European world, even their horrors, the horror they imposed on us from colonialism, and we'll say that this is a fair exchange. You've finally made reparations because you've given back the spiritual legacy of the people, of which you rubbished when you took away those pieces. And we have envisioned, okay, this is part and parcel of what we sometimes have described as the grand voyage of return, in which the diaspora, especially those of them who have never accepted the fact that outside is home, outside Africa is home, in which we'll launch a ritual kind of return, a kind of return voyage home along the slave routes. And we've spoken about, and in fact we have had one or two trial runs, very short runs, along this line, a boat in which this teaching is both leisure and teaching seminars, exhibitions, workshops, performances of all kinds, music, cuisine, African body art during that voyage. And prominent among the exhibitions on this kind of vessel that we're talking about would be an exhibition of works on their return journey home, where they belong. So just as the offspring of slaves are also making that journey back, their cultural and spiritual precipitates, which we call the artworks, are accompanying them on the way back, in addition to modern works. in addition to other modern productivity, music, the whole lot. It'll be a kind of armada of return. And it'll become a kind of annual voyage. Each time, maybe this year, Netherlands will return, will have a special gallery displaying the works which Netherlands, and then next maybe Britain, maybe families, you know, you'd be surprised what exists in terms of family collection. I mean, they really robbed that continent blind.
Yes,
and they're glorying in it. Yeah.
That is true, but we'll come back to this again, Prof. But before then, it fell on your generation when the Organization of African Unity, again, entrusted this project to some of your colleagues. The late historian Edu Boahin, Ali Mazuri, Jacob Ajay, and others were funded by Chief Abiola to look into the issue of reparation. These days it's called restitution. But to look into the issue of reparation and what will come back. The verdict of this eminent committee of scholars of your generation was that the leadership of Africa itself wasn't very keen. Their reports were not critically looked at, and the logistics that they were supposed to put into this project were never put into the project. So at the end, it died naturally. Okay. This is something that has to be campaigned on. And if you want objects that were stolen, that were looted, there must be some level of seriousness, some level of positive emotions from the cortex that these were taken from. If not, the other side sees it as just an argument. Is that not the case?
There were many complications, there still are, over the issue of reparations. You have people asking, and not rhetorically, saying, when you say reparations, are you saying payment? I mean, for me, that's just a crude concept of reparations. And this is why, for instance, my emphasis has been on returning all stolen artifacts, you know, in outside African continent, sending them back where they belong. Because for me, reparations can, it's not about money. I mean, how do you pay back? How do you compensate the millions of lives that were taken away, minds that were taken away from this continent? How do you quantify it? Okay, within the United States, they had this ridiculous thing when abolition took place. Was it 4 acres or 10 acres and a mule? You give that to somebody and you say, that's what you take for an entire life, which has been just destroyed, an entire generation, an entire sense of being. You just cannot quantify it. And so all you can do is take the symbolic route. And the symbolic route for me has always been the return. I mean, other people have other ideas, you know, but the symbolic route is that the return of those artworks and doing it in a way which engages the productive energies, the innovation capabilities of the people themselves. Now, that is one of the problems of reparations. Next, there was an attempt to dichotomize shall we say, the looting nations. Those who took away black Africans were not just Europeans. You had a prior slave culture going on between the Arab world and the black world. The red, I mean, that history is a very bleak one. And even after the European world abolished slavery, slavery still went on across the Sahara to some of the Arab nations. Till today, you still have slavery. You have slave markets. Many people don't know this. You have actual slave markets in countries like Libya. Our minister for the diaspora has done a lot of work rescuing some of our people from slavery in many other parts of the African continent. So there was a problem it kind of what I call the dubious solidarity issue, in which people like Abiola, for instance, there's no, let's get down to brass tacks, said, oh, we don't have to worry about Arab reparations from the Arab world. And another school of thought said, wait a minute. Anybody who has violated the humanity of the black people as a race has got to make reparations, otherwise forget it. So they had that problem also. The other issues were minor, like, for instance, the European world having the arrogance to say, oh, if we send those things back, how do we know you will be able to preserve them? I mean, that's very condescending and a ridiculous one. So that could be ignored. The Aksum obelisk has been returned. We haven't heard that termites ate the obelisk. And here and there, when works of art have been returned, if you go there, you see them being preserved. So that argument just never stood. They just don't want to let go, that's all. Museums, you pay to enter museums, they're making money, and they don't want to lose the revenue from people coming to see those artworks. But within also, however, we have a problem of internal reparations. Those who, we're talking about the leaders who didn't want to follow up on the whole issue of reparations. I brought something for you, which you see how our own leaders treat the even the accessible heritage of our own society. Take history, for instance. Would you be surprised to learn that in Nigeria, for about 10 years, history was banned in the schools? Many of us didn't know. We just, by accident, I think it was the governor who said he was going to put back history in the school curriculum. And we said, putting back history, you've never left it. They left it. There was a military regime which, for its own very warped interest, actually banned the teaching of history in schools. Let me just read this portion to you. I remarked earlier that some of the culture suppressors whom I have cited above has made a blatant effort to suppress history. And of course, I refer to history itself as a crucial component of art and culture, be this in the literary, musical, or iconographic art. And then I cite the Eva Valley massacre by the British colonial powers. I cite the transformation of such history at the hands of musicians, theater goers. I speak about the history of Queen Amina, whose full story has never yet been used. In other words, I'm outlining the fact that the so-called intangible heritage also is also a crucial, critical armory of literary production. And I'm not talking just about literary plays, as historical plays as such. No, the very accessibility of this historical material inspires writers, inspires artists, inspires musicians, provides cheap, easy to reach material so you don't go looking for material outside the continent. By contrast, what do our leaders do? What do they do to Maina, for instance, in Kenya, who was trying to study the fauna and flora of Kenyan landscape? He was jailed. He was accused of subversive activities. The president, I remember at the time, said, if you really want to study forestry, we can pay for you to go to Canada. But this one was there. He said he was going to consult with subversive elements. That's why he was going in the forest. You see, the memory can also play a negative thing. All they could think of was the Mau Mau, who were, of course, forest people and so on. They say, oh, yes, because this scholar was there. But he was digging out material. And the same thing with those who try to rewrite the history, let's say, of the Angolan struggle, the liberation struggle in Namibia, etc. You find leaders saying, no, you cannot touch it. And the writers either end up in jail or end up, in some cases, dead. Let's not talk about Idi Amin and what he did to writers who dared to try and write about the history of liberation in that part of the world. So it's not just external despoliation and suppression of our history. Our own leaders themselves, they have contributed negatively to the preservation of our heritage. So when you ask about, when you speak about the leaders not being all that keen on reparations, maybe they think that if some artifacts come back, and those artifacts, shall we say, artifacts which denote the, shall we say, the militant history of the nations, they think it might give people, writers, artists, musicians, ideas, which is very stupid, because you cannot suppress memory. You cannot suppress oral history anyway, any more than you can suppress the existence of those artifacts which actually narrate the history of Black Africans.
Yes, we will come to heritage again shortly. But if we go back and look at cultural data, for instance, and we look at what we have at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, we're talking about over 70 pre-publication manuscripts. Pre-publication manuscripts of your generation, of typesets, of auctorial corrections of some of the early manuscripts that were done in the 50s and 60s. Talking of Chuno Achebe's Bewell Soul Brother. We're talking of papers by Ali Mazuri. We're talking of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Weep Not Child, where the original manuscripts are kept. And they were acquired legitimately. We also talking about Ali Manzuri, who is giving his papers to his old university in New York. We're talking of Kofi Annan's UN documents are in New York. And I'm sure some of your papers are also at Harvard. But in your case, at least, we have some of these which are part of the Bookcraft series on intervention, which Bankole has been working on for years. So there is a situation or contemporary sense in which these are legitimately being acquired. And do you think they are safer there, or they should be where they should be? Ali Manzuri says that he wouldn't want his papers to be in Kenya, where they will be eaten by cockroaches. And that he will prefer these papers to be in New York, but accessible to Africans, because he thought a new generation of Africans will come who will find this useful and who will then struggle to bring them back to the homeland.
You touched on a very sensitive issue. Writers and scholars, they don't have much money. You didn't mention money. And very often, these institutions outside make writers and scholars offers they cannot refuse. There needs to be a concerted policy. We had a military ruler in Nigeria not very long ago. And he had, as a kind of prime minister, somebody who thought positively along these lines. And that he was an economist. He was a friend of mine. He managed to persuade this leader, this ruler, that he should set aside some funds for the acquisition of papers of Nigerian writers. And in fairness to that ruler, he agreed, and he did set aside this fund. Top on the list, of course, were Chinua Achebe, myself, a few others. And we'd agreed. And these papers were to be brought Nigeria installed there. The museum was to be invited, the curators, etc. Everything was in place. One day, I found myself, and we were even told, he went so far, we were told to give our bank accounts so that the money could be paid. And I did. I was then teaching in the United States. And one day, I found myself sending a letter to the bank. I said, in case some money is comes in at any time from Nigeria, please send it back immediately. Now, what happened? It just so happened that at that time, a journalist was bombed out of existence, and the finger of guilt pointed to a force within that military regime, and I wasn't satisfied with the measures being taken. There was guilt all over the place, fingerprints of guilt all over the place, and I did not want to be associated with that regime in that way. I didn't want to take any money from them, so I immediately stopped it and told that his right-hand person that I no longer wanted to sell my papers to the Nigerian government, not as long as there's a military government anyway. I can tell you that that is what killed that particular scheme, because the moment I pulled out, then everything, they said, well, if I wasn't going to agree. So it isn't that there have been efforts, it's just that our dealings with leadership are so rocky that one, from time to time, we just feel even dishonored to be associated with some of them. But if a holistic process were to be launched, where there is a policy of acquisition, including even papers which have been sold already outside, I think most of us will be most readily accept. And I mean, why should I want my papers, for instance, outside, if they could be kept here and I should be compensated for them? I mean, I sweated to produce those papers. I'm not about to dash them to anyone. These are practical issues, at least not while politicians are going abroad for their health trips, health tourism and so on, and hospitals are not being built. Why should I give my papers away to a government like that? So it's more complicated than anything else. But now that you've touched on it, I think maybe as a kind of policy of the AU, principles should be laid down and funds should be set aside so that we don't succumb to the euros and dollars and sterling of the outside world. Yeah. Writers must eat.
Good. Let's come back to the issue of heritage again. Of heritage.
Yes.
You've been traveling. In the last a month or so, you've been in Morocco, you've been in Egypt, you've been in Brazil, talking about issues to do with Africans who found themselves there centuries ago, the diaspora. And you've been engaged in projects of big dimensions, of trying to unite Africans on the mainland and those with ancestry across the Americas. Can you tell us what this really is about, and at this time?
Well, for me, it's the most logical kind of sensibility. I come from a society, like you do also, which has been subjected to centuries of racial disdain. I think we're the only, well, apart from the Slavs, from which the word slave is supposed to have emanated, but in actual, in what you might call the mundane, day-to-day conception, sensation. The word slave, that is the diminution of humanism, of one's humanity, is one which sticks, whether we like it or not, to the black world, to the black population, the black race. That is a fact. We had the internal slavery, even in South Africa, in which the South African majority was considered a fraction of the normal human being. In the United States, they even had taken it down during the slave era to a mathematical proportion. A black man is so and so percentage of an ordinary person. So you grow up, if you have any sense of history, and you are within the culture, and you see the product of your own society, of your own history. You know that civilizations have existed on this continent. Never mind if some parts have been inundated as a result of hydroelectric installations like the Aswan Dam, for instance. And so you become very aggressive, very obsessed about a recovery of the totality of what has been stolen away from your heritage. I have never looked at the outside world, the blacks in the outside world, as lost. Each time I go to the Caribbean or the United States of America and I meet black people, I feel that these belong to me. These are part and parcel of me. And any kind of mechanism which makes it possible for them to feel also a part of this society, I believe should be pursued. I always refer, for instance, look at when the Haitian, that horrendous earthquake of Haiti. I mean, one of the greatest moments of African leadership for me was when President Wade opened the gates of Senegal to get Haitian refugees and used the expression, he said, "You are not strangers, you're family. Those of you who want to return to the African continent, we're going to give you portions of land. It's not that we're doing you a favor. No. You're merely reclaiming your heritage." That's the kind of sensibility which I like to see in leadership. And we have so much also to claim as our own. One of my people ask me sometimes, what is your favorite poem? What is your this? And one recent one which I wrote, which is now my favorite, is La Ferrière, which is a poem to the citadel of King Christophe, the slave, the leader, who defeated the French when the French wanted to re-enslave Haiti, the Haitians, and he humiliated the French. And he built this incredible citadel in, what's the name of the little place? Anyway, this is incredible, which the whole world goes to study. It's not just a tourist place. Scientists, mathematicians, architects, they go to study what King Christophe built. And so that link, pride in what they achieved over there, I consider part of my heritage. And so when they're in trouble, when they suffer such a devastating reverse, for me, it's the most natural thing in the world. In fact, it's a responsibility for Africa to open its gates to all those people. Hence my obsession with this grand voyage home, in which I wish to see this regular concourse between the African continent and the diaspora. That's why when we created the Union of Writers of the African Peoples, we moved immediately to create its sister scientific organization under Sheikh Anta Diop. And if you remember, we undertook a trip around the diaspora trying to entice back the scientists.
He would have been 100 years this year if he were alive.
And unfortunately, the leadership counts so much. The leader at that time, we're always fighting, but I always give him that credit, one general. I won't mention his name, but I always give him that credit, that he backed that initiative. And he provided the funds for Professor Jeje, who was a biochemist, and myself to travel through the diaspora, talking to the scientists, to come to Sheikh and Diop sister organization. I believe that ultimately the salvation of this continent rests on our being able to associate in a very direct, productive, not just rhetorical level, but creatively, technologically, scientifically, with our extension in the diaspora.
You once said, maybe some applause. You once said that you are very much at home when you go to Jamaica because you see Yoruba rituals side by side with Roman Catholic liturgy. And for you, that is one visible sign of what went on in the past in Africa and what got transported into the Caribbean and the Americas. I think you were then going to do a documentary of the Yoruba influence in Jamaica.
You know, it's not because you say I feel very glad, very happy. No, it's not because this Yoruba religion syncretized with the Roman Catholic religion. No, it's because the Yoruba culture proves itself as one of the most resilient cultures in the world. Traveled across the Atlantic and triumphed over the tyranny of Roman Catholicism through the syncretic way, fused in so many instances. But in addition, established communities which are recognizably, till today, African, that is Yoruba. There are also Congolese sections and so on, but the most vibrant and the most artistically productive just happens to be, not my fault that I'm Yoruba, so it's not that I'm being chauvinistic, but clinically, scientifically, cut it any way you want. The Yoruba culture in the Caribbean, both Latin America, South America, Brazil, Cuba, Colombia, even in Colombia, find Yoruba culture there, both in the syncretic form and also in its pure form. And it's something, I think, which belongs to all of the African continent. It just happens to be Yoruba, that's all. I make a point of pointing to the world, of remarking to the world, that among all the religions that we know, one among a few others, but most prominently, the spirituality of the Yoruba, the religion of the Yoruba, is one religion which has never fought a war, attempted to conquer any people, convert forcibly any people, and yet, despite that repudiation of violence, it has managed to survive and even to convert others in the New World. It's a lesson for these much vaunted, quote-unquote, world religions, Christianity and Islam, to take from the Yoruba. We don't have jihadists, we don't have crusaders, we don't have violent fundamentalists. It's just there. It's a spirituality which appeals, interestingly enough, even to non-Africans. And of course, the culture which has come from that, the artworks, music, even the architecture. But if I go on, they'll say it's because I'm Yoruba now.
We will close this conversation, but we will do so on the note of the role of women in the arts. Last week, Amatiedu passed on in Accra, joining such distinguished ancestors like Flora Mwapa, Ifwa Sutherland, Maria Mamba, and others. You have said that the future of Africa literature is in the hands of contemporary African women. Do you still think is the case?
Yes. I don't know what they're giving these women to eat these days. We have to look out. They really are overtaken fast. And believe me, there are some really delightful and very accomplished literature is coming from the women, which is a good thing. Which it's about time that it makes me very proud. Very proud. It's good.
On that note, Professor Soyinka, I would like to thank you on behalf of the bank for honoring this conversation. It's been good talking to you.
Great.